Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sport all around the world. My name is Yuns Fireri, and for this fifth episode, we're gonna focus on something that is often mentioned in sports, but rarely examined seriously: enforcement. Global sports is full of rules, ethic codes, integrity units, compliance departments, arbitration panels. On paper, sport looks heavily regulated, and yet scandals keep repeating. Corruption returns, doping systems reappear, governance reforms are announced, applauded, and quietly absorbed by the same structures they were supposed to change. So the question is no longer whether sport is governed. It clearly is. The real question is something else. Who actually enforces the rules of global sports? In the last episode, we stepped back and looked at how global sports is governed without the states. We saw that organizations like FIFA and the IOC exercise authority not through police or prisons, but through control over access. Access to competitions, legitimacy, careers, and national prestige. We also saw that autonomy in sport is not independence. It is a negotiated arrangement between sports institutions and states, one that allows conflicts to be managed outside normal politics. But that analysis leaves a crucial issue unresolved, because authority only matters if it can be enforced. Rules only matter if breaking them has consequences. And governance only becomes meaningful when those in power can be held accountable. So today, we move from who governs to who policies. If sports is autonomous, who investigates wrongdoing? Who decides when rules are broken? Who gets punished and who doesn't? And more importantly, why does accountability in global sports so often stop just before it reaches the top? This episode is not about another scandal. It's about the structure that allows scandals to repeat. Because governance is not only about who decides. It's about who can enforce decisions and against whom. And once we look at the enforcement, the limits of sports governance become impossible to ignore. Let's break it down. Before criticizing enforcement in global sports, we need to be precise about what enforcement actually is and what it's not. Because one of the main problems in sports governance is conceptual confusion. Sport is very good at making rules. It is far less clear about enforcing them. And even weaker when it comes to being accountable for how enforcement is exercised. So let's separate three things that are often treated as if they were the same. First, rulemaking. This is the easiest part. International federations, the IOC, and bodies like WADA produce an enormous volume of statutes, codes, regulations, and ethical frameworks. This includes competition rules, disciplinary codes, integrity rules, and compliance obligations. From the outside, global sport looks hyper-regulated, but rules alone don't govern anything. Second, enforcement. This is where things become interesting. Enforcement means investigation, prosecution, sanctioning, and compliance monitoring. It is the moment where power becomes concrete. And here is key structural feature of global sport. Sport has no police power, no power of arrest, no power of detention, no criminal sanctions. Instead, enforcement in sport is administrative. Sporting bodies investigate internally. They prosecute internally. They judge internally again. And through arbitration bodies that themselves mandate. Sanctions are not prison sentences. They are suspensions, bans, disqualifications, exclusion from competitions, or loss of funding. In other words, enforcement in sports works through access control, access to competitions, access to careers, and access to legitimacy. This is why scholars describe global sports as a transnational private legal order, or a form of governance without a state. It exercises real authority, but without sovereign instruments. Third, accountability. This is the most fragile layer. Accountability asks different questions. Who controls the enforcers? Who reviews decisions? Who is actually sanctioned when things go wrong? In theory, sports points to arbitration, especially the CAS, as the ultimate safeguard. CAS has, without any doubt, professionalized dispute resolution and created a coherent body of jurisprudence often referred to as lex sportiva. But arbitration is not the same as democratic judicial oversight. It is reactive, not proactive. It depends on athletes or stakeholders having the resources to challenge decisions, and it rarely addresses systemic power asymmetries. This is why global administrative law scholars describe sport enforcement as quasi-public but weakly accountable. Sports bodies exercise regulatory functions similar to public authorities, rulemaking, sanctioning, yet they are not subject to the same standard of transparency, participation, or external review. Anti-doping illustrates this perfectly. WADA is a hybrid body, formally private, but partly funded and supported by governments. Its enforcement regime mirrors administrative law, standardized procedures, due process language, proportionality principles, and yet, ultimate enforcement still relies on sports federations and arbitration, not state courts. So, enforcement in global sports is not absent, but it is administrative, fragmented, and internally controlled. Which brings us to the core tension. Sport insists on autonomy to protect itself from political interference. But enforcement without external accountability concentrates power in the very institutions that are supposed to be regulated. And once enforcement power is internalized, the question is no longer whether rules exist, but who those rules are enforced against. That is where governance starts to fail. To understand why accountability in global sports so often fails, we first need to map who is actually supposed to enforce the rules. Because enforcement in sports doesn't sit in one place. It is divided across a layered architecture, internal, arbitral, and external, where authority exists, but responsibility is constantly shifted. The first line of enforcement is internal. At FIFA, the IOC, and international federations more broadly, this includes ethics committees, disciplinary committees, appeal bodies, integrity and compliance units. On paper, this looks robust. There are procedures, investigative powers, and sanctioning mechanisms. But structurally, these bodies suffer from a central problem. They are embedded within the organizations they are meant to police. Appointments are often political. Budgets depend on executive bodies. Mandates are defined by statutes written by the same institutions under scrutiny. Even when reforms are introduced, new ethics codes, independent chairs, integrity rhetoric, enforcement remains administratively internal. This creates a system where rule breaking is addressed, but only within boundaries that don't threaten institutional stability. In other words, internal enforcement is designed less to challenge power than to manage risk. This ain't accidental. It is a feature of self-regulation in monopolistic organizations, as documented extensively in the governance and competition literature. When internal processes end, enforcement is supposedly externalized to arbitration. The CAS based in Lausanne occupies a central position here. CAS is often described as the Supreme Court of world sports, but this description is misleading. CAS is not a court in the constitutional sense. It is a private arbitration institution whose jurisdiction is based on compulsory consent embedded in federation statutes and athletes' contracts. In practice, this means athletes and clubs cannot opt out. National courts are largely excluded, and CAS decisions are final, with extremely limited review by the Swiss Federal Tribunal. CAS addresses professionalized sports dispute resolution. It created uniformity, speed, but uniformity is not the same as accountability. Three structural issues persist. First, independence. While CAS has reformed its governance since the Gondel case in 1993, arbitrator selection and institutional design remain closely linked to the sports movement itself. This raises persistent concerns about structural bias, even when individual arbitrators act in good faith. Second, access. CAS proceedings are expensive, legally complex, and asymmetrical. For federations, CAS is routine. For athletes, it can be career-ending simply to litigate. Third, scope. CAS reviews individual disputes. It doesn't address systemic governance failures. It cannot sanction organizations as political actors. As a result, arbitration stabilizes the system more than giving it discipline. CAS enforces rules, but it does so within the logic of sports autonomy, not against it. Beyond arbitration, external enforcement exists, but only at the margins. National courts are formally present, but practically constrained. Judicial deference to sports autonomy, lack of internal remedies, and the recognition of CAS awards under international arbitration law all limit meaningful intervention. Governments intervene selectively. They regulate issues like doping, match fixing, or criminal corruption, but often stop short of challenging governance structures directly, especially when major events, international prestige, or economic interests are at stake. Sponsors, media, and public opinion play an informal role. They create pressure, accelerate resignations, and trigger reforms. They don't constitute enforcement in any legal sense. They are reactive, not institutional. So who enforces the rules of global sport? The answer is everyone, but not one fully. Internal bodies enforce but lack independence. Arbitration enforces but lack democratic accountability. States enforce but only episodically. The result is a fragmented enforcement system that is internally controlled, externally insulated, and structurally cautious. Rules are enforced but selectively. Sanction exists but asymmetrically. And accountability, more often than not, stops before it reaches the top. And this brings us to the central problem. Enforcement in global sports is not absent. It is designed to preserve the system rather than confront it. A useful way to see the limits of internal enforcement is to look at what happens when an external authority intervenes. A clear example is the intervention of the European Commission. In cases where sports governing bodies exercise monopoly power, for decades, international federations claimed that their regulatory decisions, eligibility rules, competition structures, disciplinary systems, were purely internal sporting matters. But from an EU perspective, these decisions also have economic effects. When a federation controls access to competition, it also controls access to markets, careers, and income. This tension became explicit in cases like International Skating Union and later the European Super League, where the Commission and the Court of Justice signaled a clear message. Sporting autonomy does not justify monopolies. What matters here is not the outcome of any single case, but the logic behind them. The EU did not intervene because governance was unethical. It intervened because self-regulation failed to constrain monopoly power. And this is revealing. Internal ethics bodies did not address the problem. Arbitration did not challenge the structure. Accountability only emerged when an external legal order applied pressure. This tells us something fundamental. When enforcement remains internal, it tends to protect institutional authority. When enforcement comes from outside, it suddenly becomes possible to question who holds power and on what basis. And this is precisely why enforcement in global sports is so politically sensitive. Because effective enforcement doesn't just punish wrongdoing, it redefines where authority ends. And that is why, in practice, enforcement so often stops before it reaches the top. If enforcement were neutral, we would expect rules to apply equally to everyone in global sports. They do not. To understand why enforcement so often fails at the top, we need to compare how enforcement operates depending on who is subject to it. And nowhere is this clearer than in the contrast between athletes and executive. Athletes are the most regulated actors in global sport. They are subject to strict liability regimes, continuous monitoring, immediate provisional suspensions, standardized sanctions. In anti-doping, intent is secondary. Responsibility is individualized. The burden of proof is effectively reversed. Once a violation is established, enforcement is rapid, public, career-ending. This is often justified in the name of integrity of competition, harmonization, legal certainty. And from a governance perspective, it works. Rules are enforced. Outcomes are predictable. Authority is visible. But notice something important. Athletes are replaceable. They have limited bargaining power. They do not control institutions. Strict enforcement here does not threaten the system. It demonstrates that the system works. Now, compare this with enforcement against senior officials, executive or governing elites. Here, enforcement looks very different. Investigations take years. Procedural complexity multiplies. Sanctions, when they occur, are often negotiated or symbolic. Instead of bans, we see suspensions later reduced, resignations framed as voluntary, ethics finding without structural consequences, responsibility becomes collective, casualty becomes diffuse, blame is institutional rather than personal, and crucially, enforcement becomes destabilizing. Sanctioning an executive is not just punishing an individual, it risks exposing governance failures, power networks, and institutional complicity. So enforcement slows down, processes multiply, outcomes soften. This is not hypocrisy, it is structural self-protection. This contrast tells us something fundamental. Enforcement in global sports doesn't follow wrongdoing alone. It follows power relations. Where enforcement reinforces authority, it is strong. Where enforcement threatens authority, it becomes cautious. This is why governance reforms often focus on codes, procedures, transparency indicators, but stop short of executive accountability, structural sanctions, external oversight. Good governance becomes performative, accountability becomes selective, justice becomes managerial, and this is not accidental. Global sport is a monopolistic regulatory system. It governs itself through private authority. And like all self-regulating systems, it enforces rules most aggressively where resistance is weakest. Seen that way, enforcement is not primarily about ethics. It is about stability. Athletes are disciplined to protect credibility. Executives are managed to protect continuity. And this is why scandals do not lead to rupture. They lead to reform cycles, new committees, new codes, new language, but the same distribution of power. And this is the real limit of sports governance. Not the absence of rules, not the absence of enforcement, but the absence of equal exposure to enforcement. So, when we ask why accountability in global sports so often stops at the top, the answer is not that the system is broken, it is that the system is working as designed. Enforcement exists, but it is selective, and selectivity is how power preserves itself. One of the main paradoxes of modern sports governance is this. The more scandal we observe, the more governance frameworks we produce. Yet, enforcement asymmetries remain largely unchanged. The literature helps explain why. First, good governance in sports has become primarily procedural. Across major frameworks, from Transparency International guidelines to EU-backed governance handbooks, good governance is defined through codes, indicators, structures, and reporting mechanisms, rather than through binding sanctioning power. Transparency, accountability, participation, and integrity are treated as organizational attributes, not enforceable constraints. This creates what scholars describe as a compliance-oriented model. Sport organizations are encouraged to demonstrate governance rather than to submit to it. Ethic committees exist, codes of conduct are published, annual reports are issued, but the capacity to trigger independent investigations or impose consequences remains limited or absent in many international federations. Second, enforcement is structurally the weakest pillar of good governance. Empirical studies on international sports governing bodies constantly show gaps in checks and balances, weak separation between executive and disciplinary powers, and a lack of independent oversight mechanisms with real autonomy. In other words, governance frameworks excel at preventive design, but are very weak at corrective action. Third, and most importantly, governance reforms often absorb crisis instead of redistributing power. Following scandals, organizations adopt new standards, revise statutes, or endorse governance principles. Yet, these reforms tend to operate within existing hierarchies, leaving executive dominance largely intact. As several reviews note, there is still no agreed, enforceable, and empirically validated set of governance principles that improves accountability outcomes in sports organizations. This explains the pattern observed through this episode. Athletes and lower-level actors experience direct, rapid, and individualized enforcement, while senior officials remain subject to procedural, negotiated, and often opaque accountability mechanisms. So the issue is not a lack of governance norms. It is that good governance has become a language of legitimacy rather than a system of constraint. Throughout this episode, we have not been asking whether global sport has rules, because it clearly does. The more difficult question is what those rules can actually do and who they can reach. Looking at enforcement forces us to move beyond the language of ethics, integrity, and reform, and toward a more uncomfortable reality. Governance in global sports is effective where it stabilizes the system, and cautious where it would disrupt existing power relations. This doesn't mean that governance efforts are meaningless. It means that their limits are structural. As long as enforcement remains largely internal, administrative, and insulated from external oversight, accountability will continue to be uneven, not because of individual failure, but because of institutional design. Understanding this distinction matters because it shifts the debate away from personalities and scandals and toward the conditions under which authority and power is exercised, constrained, or protected. And that ultimately is what sports governance is about. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. If you found this useful, make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn. You were listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Yunus Ferrari. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.